What's the most fucked up story you've heard? Not my story, but I remember my mother telling me this. We lived in a small cul-de-sac back in 2012. I wasn't home at the time. Unfortunately, my brother was, though he didn't see anything. There was a woman who lived across from us, and her ex-husband had come over to the house and shot her. My stepdad had heard arguing and then gunshots. He said he opened the window to see the man fleeing. My mother had called 911. My stepdad ran outside to see if the woman was okay, only to find her slumped up dead in her home. He ended up having to testify in court over what he saw that day. It was really sad. The ex-husband took a mom away from her 2 kids, a father in prison and a mother who's deceased. That situation has always been stuck in my mind, even though I wasn't home that day. Edit. Another thing that happened as well, back in 2018. This man and his son moved into our condo complex next door to us after the man had recently separated from his wife. The son was about 17 or 18, I'd say. I didn't know the son very well, more like acquaintances. Occasionally in passing, we'd say hi to each other and go about our business. One day I found out the son killed himself. From hearing what happened, he had been tied up in some drug dealing and just messy drug shit. Apparently he had a warrant out for his arrest and cops were looking for him. He drove to a Publix that was next to my complex and he shot an off-duty officer who was grabbing lunch and then turned the gun on himself, and he died. The officer lived but was rushed to critical. After that, I barely ever saw the father, and when I did, he looked so miserable and depressed. As a mom myself, I can't imagine losing my child in a horrible way like that. Story number 2. Maybe not the most fucked up, but a friend of a friend was painting apartments in NYC during summer break from college. He had an inside line on expensive apartments, where he was paid a lot of money, presumably because he was trustworthy. He would typically get high just before arriving and at lunch break, so he was pretty baked on the job. At one point, when the client was out, he accidentally kicked an open can of paint and spilled it on an obviously expensive Persian carpet. The apartment owner came home and saw the mess. She was distraught and asked the painter what happened. He said, "I was painting and the dog walked by and knocked over the paint." The owner had a dog, of course. The owner said angrily, "That's it. That dog has caused enough trouble. We'll have to put her down." Faced with this moral dilemma, this friend of a friend chose to say nothing, let the dog take the heat, and get put down just to save his own stoned ass. I think he touches money on Wall Street now or something. Story number 3. So, when I arrived in Asia, the first guy's house I stayed in, he lived there with his family, daughter, and wife. After day 1, when I felt more comfortable, we were all sitting down to eat dinner, having a lovely time, sharing stories, chatting about life, and so forth. Now, the next day, we are having our morning tea, and he tells me about how each Sunday he travels the country giving out free Bibles. So we are talking about this, and after a few minutes I ask him, "When did you start this or why?" He tells me about the day he missed church, the first time missing church in over 10 years, and on this day a suicide bomber entered the church where his friends and family had died. I started crying at this point. So ever since that day, he said he feels as though God was looking out for him, or that he received a message about how you don't have to go to church each day to be a man of God. Since this day, he's not gone back to church unless for weddings or baptisms and confirmations, but travels around the country handing out Bibles and spreading wisdom as though he believes this calling is for the greater good. I was still weeping at this point, and gave him a big hug, as he lost 2 of his best friends and also family members. This guy was also such a lovely man, and made my stay feel as though I was at home, even though I was on the other side of the world. To me, so far at the age of 22, this is the craziest and most touching story I've been told. Story number 4. Here's a long one with a little light at the end of the tunnel. My dad grew up with a wildly abusive mother and was a stubborn little hellraiser from infancy. She did awful things like making him eat his own vomit and beat him with studded belts. Lots I doubt I'll ever hear. Despite being one of the youngest, he'd round his siblings up to try to run away together. She left him home alone once when he was very young, and he decided she wasn't allowed to come back, so he started throwing her stuff out the windows. Eventually, the family decided to move to Australia for better opportunities, but couldn't afford to move everyone at once. They split the family, my grandmother staying in their home country with some of the kids, my grandfather taking the rest, with plans to earn some money and send for the rest. When they arrived, my grandfather promptly abandoned the kids. As an adult, my dad would learn he moved a few hours away and started another family. Ouch. He and his siblings grew up in kids' homes, like orphanages, I guess, and their mother fought to have them returned, but failed. I don't know a lot about that time. My dad tells lighter stories about how their guardians played dodgeball by kicking balls as hard as they could against the lined-up children. He tells about the time he did art class, and they decided to paint the teacher instead, or when he lit his desk on fire because someone told him he wouldn't really do it. He lightly mentions beatings and lots of times he ran away because being on the streets was better than being there. He stole a car by the time he was 10 and went for a joyride before parking it in a pool. One time, someone tried to gouge his eye out over mistaken identity. His eye is still really bad from it. He was a heavily institutionalized youth criminal that the system, if it had ever cared at all, had given up on. If you know much about the backstories of Charles Manson or Albert Fish, it's not too far off that from the small amounts I've heard. Since then, the government has formally apologized to wards of the state and paid them out, given free dental, etc., because they ruined the lives of a lot of kids. My dad doesn't really have a formal education. He's still not very good at school-taught skills like spelling, but he's damn smart with a practical, logical mind. He hitchhiked around the country a lot, keeping a knife in his boot. A random couple took him under their wing, and he'd come and go as he pleased. The husband of the couple knew Chopper, an absolute nightmare of a mad lad. Check out the movie if you haven't. Rough circles, you know? One day, when he was about 18, my dad was catching up with his brother. "Where are you living these days?" my dad asked. "In a share house with a group of girls. You should come over." "A house full of girls? Sounds good to me." When they were walking up to the house, a girl was walking out. My dad looked at his brother and said, "That's the girl I'm going to marry." The girl in question was a good Catholic girl. After her father died young, the church took it upon themselves to put his 5 daughters through school. They were the poor kids at a very well-off school, charity cases basically. They sometimes got sent to kids' homes themselves when their mother couldn't afford to feed them. That was good. They got lots of food. But they always got to come home too. The girl was fiery and argumentative herself, and passionate about fairness. In school, she often got in trouble for standing up for others, and would take the punishment with her head held high because she knew she did the right thing. Her sisters would insist she was adopted, and nobody loved her. Siblings, I guess. Her mother could be very cruel and abusive at times, but very genuinely loving and generous at others. It was disorienting. But her family were all a little weird. Quirky, they called themselves. Walked to the beat of their own drum. Just a little different. Nothing wrong with that. And who wants to follow the crowd anyway? They would later discover that they were not just a little quirky. They were severely mentally ill, and it would lead to a lot of young deaths. There were at least 2 generations who needed electroconvulsive therapy, electroshock, and time will tell if that continues. The girl would learn about the despicable human being her father really was, and what he did to his daughters, including her. Things she couldn't remember because she was so young when he died. Her older sisters would one day have to break down the pedestal she had put her father on. No longer the light of her childhood, taken too soon. But all of that would be much later. This girl grew up on the good side of the law and surrounded by privilege, even if she wasn't part of it herself. She was used to gallant, clean-cut boys with good families, ones who brought flowers and shyly asked to hold hands. She was not used to boys who tore up the school's lawn on their motorbikes, not used to scruffy street kids with a disregard for the law. She was not impressed. Instead of flowers, he brought her a potted plant because flowers would just die. A plant made more sense. She told him to get a haircut and get a job. He did, and came back to see her again. Obviously, that girl is my mother. Both of my parents' lives were fucked up. They both had cycles of abuse to break in a time when things like that just weren't acknowledged. We never had much financially when I was growing up, and they still don't own a house or anything like that, but they made damn sure I always had a roof over my head, food on my plate, clean clothes, and school. I grew up loved and safe, and they never resented me for having what they didn't. Because parents are supposed to try to give their children what they didn't have. A lot of the replies are dark. My parents, especially my dad, towed the line of going down that road, and in slightly different circumstances, they might have. I've always found people using their past as an excuse for their shitty behavior hard to swallow because, perhaps as a result of my parents and how they raised me, I've always been drawn to people with similarly painful pasts. When someone uses it as an excuse, well, I've almost certainly known someone who has experienced worse and chosen to be better. I went through domestic violence as a young adult, and my abuser tried that tactic with little success. I've heard a lot of dark stories from friends, partners, and strangers. Those aren't mine to share in the way this one is. Most of them are still happening, and it's not my place. So I wanted to add some hope here. Cycles can be broken. Light can be found in dark places. Better can exist, even if it's not perfect. Hurt people isn't good enough. Don't accept it as an excuse for yourself or others. Some might look down on you for not meeting their ideas of success, but that's when you hold your head up and say, "F you," because we don't all walk the same paths from the same starting point. We just have to do our best with whatever shitty hand we were dealt. We have to try to be better than what came before. Terrible things can and do happen all the time, but the good is worth fighting for. Anyway, my parents are cool, and I'm proud of them. Well, thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more incredible Reddit tales. Share your thoughts or your own experiences in the comments below. I love hearing from you all. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring those amazing stories.